Hello and welcome to a new series of interviews by Forum Nepantla, where we focus on politics, philosophy, and technology. I am joined in this series by our new contributor, Gonzalo, and our first guest, Daniel Baryon, who manages the YouTube channel Anarch. We will talk today about anarchism and its relation to technology and philosophy. Welcome, Daniel. Can you please tell us a few words about yourself?
Okay. Yeah, my name is Daniel. I run a YouTube channel called Anarch. The channel, as I see it, is a channel which is meant to sort of popularize and explain anarchist and broadly sort of libertarian socialist theory. I'm definitely not trying to water it down to where it's, made for mass consumption. I'm really trying to deliver it on the level that I think is appropriate for people to understand the concepts and really trusting the intelligence of my audience. So yeah, that's the project I'm carrying out there. But I actually have a much larger following on Twitter because that's where I started. I've been a political radical since 2011 when I joined the Occupy. 2008 was definitely a radicalizing event for me. But yeah, I guess I'm pretty well read in philosophy, but probably not as well read as you guys. I minored in philosophy for my undergrad, but I had been studying for philosophy for years beforehand.
I really like your vision of not watering down any of the stuff that you talk about in your YouTube channel. And I think this relates nicely to the first question that I wanted to ask you. And it's something that you addressed on Twitter, where you saw somebody calling Trump the bigger anarchist of them all. And you quite quickly reacted and said, no, he's not an anarchist. It's a contradiction to call him an anarchist. And this shows that many people have a watered down understanding of the concept, and that a lot of people operate with a confused notion of anarchist. So maybe like an introduction would be really appropriate to have like a working definition for the discussion. So something that guides us so that we don't fall into naive confusions.
Yeah, yeah. I think anarchism, anarchy, anarchists, those words are probably some of the most thoroughly debased words in all of political dialogue. I think they have been confused on purpose, I might add. I think that the history of anarchism, that wasn't the case in the early 1900s. I mean, there was some propaganda, some anti-anarchist propaganda, which was attempting to redefine those words into the things they are now. But it was not nearly as successful. Just an average person calling themselves anarchist back in the early 1900s would have been seen as much similar to what we mean when we say we're a socialist or even maybe a communist now. So, but they've been thoroughly debased in the years since then. So I guess a working definition. I found that there's a lot of ways to kind of come at the description of what anarchism is, in the same way that there's a lot of ways to kind of come at describing what socialism and communism are. But I think the general underlying principle is that anarchism is the radical opposition to hierarchies in human society, right? So this is sort of an inherently intersectional approach, which is to say that it doesn't see itself as reductively economic. It doesn't just focus on one particular aspect, one particular hierarchy and oppose it. It finds all social hierarchies to be damaging in their fundamental nature. And then really the ones perhaps that it sees as most damaging are the ones where there are concentrations of power, where certain people are given formal power over one another. So we can see that taking place in the state. So that's why anarchists are broadly anti-state. You can see it's taking place in capitalism with the ownership of private capital. You can see it taking place in white supremacy with the placement of white identities over, black identities largely, especially in America. You can see it in a variety of different places, right? You can see it in the placement of particular gender ideologies and the usage of those in order to create systems of oppression. And anarchism places itself in opposition to all of those systems of oppression.
Okay, thank you. I think so. I want to make a clarifying statement or maybe a question. You've mentioned it has been misused on purpose. And I think that has a lot to do with this definition of anarchy as opposition or resistance to hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a nice clarifying statement is something that you give in your first video on what is the state. And there you specify that it's not just against hierarchies, but it's against the top-down structure of hierarchies.
Yeah.
So maybe to round it up a bit, it's more about finding a level plane of interaction in which power relations get properly distributed. It's not concentrated somewhere at the top of the hierarchy and then superimposed on somebody. Would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, centralization is really just a problem insofar as what you can see is it produces a hierarchy of power, right? It creates some privileged class of people. Those privileged class of people then hold power over everyone else. Now, you'll find a bunch of centralists who might disagree with that fact, and they'll disagree with it for, I would say, mostly sophistry, reasons of sophistry, where they're really doing like vast and reinterpretations of words and dancing around the subject. But yeah, centralization is a problem because it creates a hierarchy of control. And so, yeah, I guess to clarify and agree, anarchism is not anti-structural. It's not anti-coordination. It's not anti-organizational either. It actually, the systems that most anarchists advocate are going to be systems of vast coordination, of vast organization. And in fact, they're going to take a complete reorganization of society in many cases.
Okay, thank you. I think we have like two topics that can function as transition to my next question, namely centralized systems and the hierarchies that they imply. And Gonzalo and I and our other collaborators work on speculative realism and specifically with flat ontologies within the speculative realist movement. And flat ontologies are the leveling of ontology in which there is no primacy of one entity over the other, but all are equally real, and there are no hierarchical relations between them. So to be more precise, in the history of philosophy, mostly modern philosophy, reality has been often understood as dependent to an ordering subject, an identical self-evident subject that puts everything into order. And flat ontologies say, no, there is no higher subject that comes and puts order into matter. There's just interacting autonomous nodes, so to say, autonomous objects. And this presents itself as a nice descriptional level for anarchism, in my opinion. But I wanted to ask you if you think these new philosophies are compatible with anarchism, or do you think they maybe run the danger of getting rid of the subject, and by that, giving way to philosophies or politics in which the individual and its autonomy can be transgressed, so to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is an enormous topic. I imagine we could make the entire topic of our discussion today that. But what I will say is, one thing I want to emphasize about anarchism is anarchism doesn't necessarily tell you how to form a metaphysics or how to form an ontology. The way I see politics is they arrive after those conclusions, right? You could form almost any metaphysics and arrive at an anarchistic conclusion. So the way I see anarchism is that it is a political ideology first and foremost. Now, what you've described, insofar as we have flat ontologies, I just understand it to mean that we're sort of eliminating the distinction between the subject and the object. And I've long believed that there isn't actually a distinction between the subject and the object, that there is in fact just one vast interconnected object. But this is because I'm a physicist. I'm formally trained as a physicist. So I think, having seen so much of the hard science perception of how the world is organized, it becomes very difficult to conceive of where the room for a subject that is apart from the world as it stands really can even exist, like where that subject would be. I don't think that it insofar as we take those as the foundations for how the physical world functions, I don't think that it actually gives us any problems for anarchism. because when we're reasoning about things in politics, we're reasoning post-ethics most of the time, which is not to say without ethics. It's to say we've already arrived upon a bunch of ethical conclusions. And I personally believe that ethics arise from also your sort of metaphysical conclusions and how you look at the world and believe things interrelate. So you end up with politics built on top of this vast structure of philosophical foundation. And therefore, anarchism could be arrived upon by almost any of these, right? I found anarchists who are thoroughly postmodernist, who, you know, some of them believe everything is the subject almost, is the way it seemed. Then you've got some that are thoroughly analytical, who believe, you know, kind of the exact opposite, who really have an extreme faith in science. The original anarchists, in fact, had a great deal of faith in the way science functioned in the physical world, and really considered themselves thoroughly materialist. So I don't think that that any of these assumptions are going to preclude you from arriving at anarchism. If I can, you know, try to summarize this discussion here.
Okay. But you'd say that you would be able to arrive at an anarchist political philosophy, let's say, with a subject-object distinction.
Yeah, I think you could arrive there with that as well. I think you know, that's actually largely presumed in much of the philosophy that I've ever read, is that there is this subject-object distinction. And I think maybe that the early anarchists may have taken for granted that in fact it would have existed. I don't think it really ever came into bearing in how they thought that power structures functioned and the exploitation that took place that was inherent to the way those power structures functioned, and the problems with hierarchy as they just kind of stood as fundamental philosophical entities is sort of just kind of stands apart from that. I don't think that whether the subject philosophically exists or whether the distinction is blurred is really too relevant to the facts about what is good for human beings and what actually provides a better functioning society for human beings. I think you could probably arrive at these conclusions just by simple observation of what does and does not, you know, present human beings with, you know, greater happiness, with greater sense of fulfillment, that, you know, what does or does not find itself in opposition to those fundamental needs of human beings, and the distress that they experience when hierarchies of power are formed in society, as a matter of fact, right?
I was mostly asking because you do see a tendency in Western societies that this dualism is to be more present. And the birth of capitalism did come from this subject-object distinction in some way, because it kind of gives you a way to use this mapping on everything. You can objectify almost anything and turn it into a tool to get something else. In societies where there, for example, polytheistic societies, or in, for example, African animist societies, you do see a much flatter structure, less hierarchies, and almost closer to an anarchical religious setting in some ways. So I was asking mostly because of that as well, that these things tend to map in some ways to the societal structures that are there.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. Definitely not saying that these philosophical principles may not make you have a higher tendency to tend one way or another to come to particular conclusions. But I think that when we look at, for example, the entire Enlightenment period, what you'll see is that a great deal of that Enlightenment period, at the same time when you had, you know, I think, therefore I am, and you had this very much the centering of the subject aspect, you also had extreme anti-authoritarianism entering into the conversation. Right. So this extreme opposition to monarchy, this extreme opposition to the centralization of power away from the freedom of the individual, which is sort of proto-anarchism in some ways. It's just an incomplete anarchism, you might say. It's an anarchism which doesn't conceive of the broader problem of hierarchies as they stand. David Graeber has done interesting work talking about how the Enlightenment thinkers may have been thoroughly influenced by the records of conversations that were being had with indigenous people in North and Central America at the time when, you know, the Enlightenment was taking place, or rather, you know, the contemporaries of that time. and that a lot of the questions they were having about authority were informed by the indigenous Americans looking at their authority structures, hearing about their authority structures and saying, how does any of this make sense? How do you justify any of these things? This all seems like complete nonsense. Explain. And then the Enlightenment thinkers going, oh, you're right. These are really weird justifications. How do we work through all these hierarchies? Why do we let all these hierarchies exist? It sure doesn't seem like they need all of them. And they had to have vast systems of justification that popped up as a countervailing notion to these accounts. So I think that you can find anarchism present in a ton of different ideologies. I think you'll find that it's kind of an incomplete conception of full opposition to hierarchy. You'll find it partially in the Enlightenment, partially in indigenous American communities. You'll find it in African communities. You'll find it all over the place. I think really what maybe perhaps defines anarchism in its particular form is just that it looks at all of these hierarchies and says, it sure seems like all of these are causing problems. It doesn't seem like I can really pick out just this one or that one and then say that's the problem. It looks like all of them are an issue.
That's a really interesting point. And I think we can relate this to what you said about anarchism and how it has been misused, for example. Because the same thing can be said about modern philosophy and Enlightenment philosophy. Because of course they did accept that the relation between subject and object was an artificial one, was for description purposes. But at the same time, they describe this relation in levels that are top-down ordered. Namely, you have the rational, you have the cognitive, and then right at the bottom, you have the anthropological, where you have the emotional, you have the affective side. And this system is structured in such a manner that it gives way to justification of oppression of the affective, of the emotional, of the rationally weaker one, so to say. And this also makes place for narratives that discriminate women, for example, that discriminate against the indigenous, and so on and so forth. So I think it's more about, like you said, about the overlaying political narrative that takes all of the structures and orders them in order to gain power and retain power.
Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, I think there are some structures which are just fundamentally harder to co-opt for power structures, right? But I also think that almost any structure could probably be co-opted in some manner or another by power structures. So you take, for example, postmodernism. So much of postmodernism was an attempt to countervail the narratives of inherent power structures, right? Trying to look at how power has corrupted the way that we look at, societies and the way we perceive the frames of different societies, and how that power is sort of inherently intertwined within how we interpret the events around us. And you might think that because that analysis was the one that they took, that would mean postmodernism was not going to be able to be co-opted. But that's just not true at all. In fact, a large degree of capitalist realism is the co-optation of the subjective aspects of postmodernism. That is how it does a lot of its brainwashing of society. It almost takes it for granted. It sort of hyper emphasizes the subjective aspect and then says, yeah, everybody's opinion is basically the same. So how can you really condemn your employer for exploiting you? What? It's all just everybody's opinion. It got exploited. It got expanded, maybe outside of what the postmodernists would have liked, but it did get co-opted. I think almost any structure possibly could be co-opted. But one of the things that sort of attracts me to anarchism is that inherently it demands not to be co-opted. It demands power for the people. So yeah, I don't think it's impossible for it to be co-opted. I mean, look at anarcho-capitalism, for example. Mm-hmm. But I think that insofar as we take very seriously the opposition to hierarchy, we at least place ourselves in a position where we're less likely to be co-opted.
Yeah, I like that. And I like that you bring up postmodernism and this paradox of turning out to be, or ending up to be, the exact repetition of structure and hierarchy. And more than that, it also leads to the negation of science, of facts, like the material. And that makes way for populism. And this leads me to my next question, because we have seen recently in philosophy, especially combined with social theory and political theory, a reaction to postmodernism in the form of posthumanism. And posthumanism tries to mediate a bit between the postmodern and the modern. And it sees the world, so to say, as, like you also mentioned, like this one big interconnected mesh of things. And you have the non-human and the human. But you also have translation processes between the two. And they focus on these translation processes and also give attention to the voice of the non-human, that the non-human appeals to us and it intrigues us and it invites to give a translation and to translate ourselves in order to meet the requirements of the non-human. This seems like a good way to avoid static structures, to avoid static relations, in the sense that you focus on the translation process, on the process itself, where you continuously stay in a state of change. And that somehow is not so friendly when you think of appropriating structures for power, because the structure changes. Yeah, do you think like this organic approach would be beneficial in relegating power structures?
I think as far as what I understand of what you've described, I think that, it could be very helpful in dissolving the justifications for power structures as they currently stand. That there's no doubt about that. I mean, so much of how the current power structures function, sort of as Bookchin has talked about, is in separating humanity from nature. Sort of turning humanity into this thing that stands above nature, that is not in relation to it, that in fact nature is just this vast thing to be exploited. And I think that, insofar as that we can include some sort of organic relation of humanity to nature, we recover a lot of very important things that are going to be needed in order to change that paradigm, in order to dissolve that old power structure and to build a new ecological power structure. I think much of how I see humanity's relation to these things, and perhaps once again, this is just like the physicist in me, is feedback cycles. So this is something I think a lot about processes as feedback cycles. Often I'll find some dichotomy where everybody's like taking one side or the other. And I'll find that really what's happening is that both sides of the dichotomy just appear to be in feedback with one another. That it seems like, there's a action-reaction cycle that just kind of takes place forever. And the entire universe, and so if we're kind of looking at it in a quantum mechanical sense, is doing that all the time, right? The entire universe, whether you're going to use the Copenhagen interpretation or whatever, all of these quantum mechanical wave functions are in interaction with each other at all times. Every single aspect of every system is constantly enforcing and reinforcing other parts of the system, and it becomes very difficult for that reason to predict things. So I don't know. I'm not very well educated on the movement you're speaking of, but it sounds to me like it at least has some relation to those things.
It does, and it indeed highlights this relational aspect, and also the possibility of polycentric structures. So you don't have just one structure spreading out, like an imperialistical structure, so to say, but you have multiple roots, so to say, from which decisions arise, interactions, and so on and so forth, and they inform and complete themselves. You have this, for example, in the organization of the Zapatistas, where you have different communes that inform themselves, they cohabit, but they don't govern each other. They grow together, so to say. You also see this, what you said about the ecological aspect of it. You see a lot of it being implemented in Ecuador, Bolivia, for example, where they introduced the notion of buen vivir in their constitutions, and they give nature juridical rights. And I think this is a good stepping stone to talk about Deleuze, for example. and his non-centric structure, his rhizomatic structure. And he says that a lot of hierarchical structures are based on a binary logic that gives way to a tree structure in which one root is the main origin of everything. Everything can be traced back to that one root. And his point is, no, this is not how nature works. Nature grows from multiple roots. And evolution is possible because distinct roots grow together and inform themselves as part of a bigger structure, but at the same time, they retain their autonomy. This has been used a lot as an interpretation of the internet, which is also one of the main topics we wanted to ask you about. And a lot of people have used Deleuze as their stepping stone to explain the internet as a non-hierarchical medium. But at the same time, there are critics to that and say, no, the internet just repeats the same hierarchical structures in which a top-down principle applies. How do you see the impact of internet in political structures, in political narratives, and how people interact with power relations?
I find that to be like a very complicated subject. It's very complex, right? So first of all, I got to say, I think that I have a lot of trust in what's been called Conway's law before, which is to say the products of any given organization are going to mirror the power structures of the organization. So I think there's a very high likelihood that the fact that the internet was developed by DARPA, and that was a big aspect of how it was developed, probably has some, relating factor to it having some hierarchies to it. But the fact it was also developed by CERN, which is to say by scientists who generally function very decentralized as their sort of natural functioning, probably is also a reason why it has aspects of that decentralization. So I think you're going to find quite a bit. You're going to find both in the internet, because it was the project of both CERN and DARPA, and Conway's law says you're going to get the program, you're going to have it programmed with the inherent structures of whatever the power structure was that developed the product. So I think that's part of the reason why you probably see both, right? It probably has aspects of both, but I think which one is going to express itself is going to be very much a factor of however we mediate it, which is to say the internet, if it is not administered as a top-down structure, is a very, as you've described it, rhizomatic thing, right? It's very much, it grows of its own volition. It's extremely decentralized. Every node can build its own echo chamber, but it can also develop upon the path that is most natural and organic to it. Yet at the same time, when the time comes when power structures want to control the internet, they're going to have the ability to do so, because the way the internet is structured, all they have to do is go to the servers that literally just house and connect all of the nodes, and they would have high degrees of control over the input and output of information. However, one thing making it very difficult is, even if they were to try, it is next to impossible for a centralized structure to actually process the astounding amount of information that is on the internet. And this is what you see taking place. And this is the limitation of dystopian programs like PRISM here in America, where they're wiretapping Americans constantly. We basically know that now, right? But they can't process it all. Like, they're in a situation where they literally just can't process it, right? There's just too much at this point. So they have to create these bots which crawl the enormous amount of information and just hope to find keywords. And then even then, they have to compile it into another database that is still too massive for them to crawl. And then they just hope that when the time comes, they've got a suspect or something that they can just point their fingers to the database. Oh, did he say terrorism? Did he say 9/11? And then go and look it up in this massive database, still too large for them to crawl. So it has aspects of both, I suppose you could say. I think it probably is more the decentral aspect than it is the hierarchical aspect, if I could maybe qualify one or the other. It has been given over now for too long to the organic functioning of human beings and the development of sort of naturally anarchistic software development for it to really be able to be subsumed by fully hierarchical demands.
Okay, thanks. I think one of the essential points is also that we do need to mediate. It's not something that's inherently revolutionary.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It can be used against us. It's already being used against us.
Yeah. Okay, I think with that point, I want to give the stage to Gonzalo, who is more tech savvy, and maybe discuss more in detail how networks function and how we might mediate in a revolutionary way.
Yeah, I think you made a great introduction of how the evolution of the structure of the internet and how it has both decentralized and distributed components, and also regarding the history of industrialization and how physics played a part in this, in terms of optimization and generating optimization processes to produce things with more efficiency, which basically generate a lot of centralizing structures in itself. Because it was, in some senses, probably the most easiest processes to understand. And now you're seeing slowly the rise of, both in science and both in the internet as well, some notions of decentralized structures and some ideas of how to analyze both ecosystems, decentralized protocols for the internet, and also understanding ecologies and economies in a decentralized manner with Bitcoin and other protocols. So my question to you is, how do you see, for example, now with the emergence of a lot of messaging protocols such as Matrix, there's also this social network called Scuttlebutt, and they all based on this decentralized self-hosted alternative. How do you see these are tools for facilitating the mediation between these anarchic communities, not only in a local geographical sense, but in a more transnational and global sense?
You know, I think they have a great potential if only they could get user bases. That's really the issue here, right? Like, we already actually have things, I think, which are superior to Twitter, for example, like Mastodon. Like, I think Mastodon is actually just a superior platform to Twitter, but it lacks one thing, and that is the user base, right? When you get on Mastodon, it's not even half the number of people. It's not even a quarter of the number of people. It's probably like a single-digit % of the number of people, if even, right? And that just makes them very difficult to catch on. I mean, the fact that you have Google, who's a massive transnational corporation, possibly the most powerful corporation on the face of the planet, still was unable to just artificially create a social network, right? Like, Google Plus was just a failure, just dead ended. So there's like this weird game of chance that plays out where it almost doesn't even matter how well you develop the network, how much promise it has, whether it has some new innovative feature. I personally can't even tell you what the qualities are that lead to some user base choosing some social media network. Like, now I can kind of backwards say why I think some of these networks have succeeded. Like Twitter, it seems quite apparent that lots of people are flooding into it because it's really good for political conversation. But even then, is it really good for political conversation? It just so happens to be the place where there's a lot of political conversation taking place. And then it's like, when you developed Twitter, I'm certain they didn't develop Twitter with the concept in their minds this was going to be the place where all of the political conversation took place. So then, I don't know. It's hard for me to really even say what's going to happen with all of these different platforms. Seems like there's already superior platforms out there that if people were to just analyze side by side, oh, look at these features and look at those features, they should be choosing alternatives, but they're not. So I don't know what to predict of what will take place.
Given the way also in which science has become centralized in a lot of different ways. For example, in financing, you have funding agencies which not only define what gets funded, but they also are actively pushing for particular narratives in terms of what is deemed as science and what is deemed as research worthy of being funded. You also have some private funds, but the biggest bulk of the money goes usually from national funding agencies. And you have scientific journals, which in themselves are more problematic because they are a huge bottleneck to how science is peer reviewed and how science is then turned into the discourse. Right now, there are very few alternatives. You have preprint journals, which are useful to some sense, but they lack a lot of the peer review and a lot of the work needs to be done to actually see through a paper and see that it actually contains valuable information, which is, let's say, this is the most decentralized area of the spectrum, a preprint server, and then you have a journal, which is the most centralized. We need to kind of reach a point in the middle where we have much more peer review happening, but at the same time, something that is able to be reliable, because it's like you cannot do away with centralization completely. Mm-hmm. So how do you see knowledge and the formation of knowledge, and how do you see what tools could an anarchist society build to avoid something like an echo chamber, which is something that happens usually in very closed societies, which have very few nodes of communication with other societies? How do you see these tools, and what do you see as alternatives for these types of systems?
Well, I think one of the problems in science right now, and I think this is not a secret, is that paywalling is causing a huge issue for just like the openness of information. And it becomes very difficult for science to argue that it is open to everyone's criticism and everyone needs to come and give their feedback, when I literally just can't even afford to see half the science that's out there. And you end up in these situations where people who try to open science out to the public end up in really terrible situations, right? So it becomes very challenging to imagine how it can be changed in this society, right? I could probably give a variety of different things that could be changed to benefit science. But in an anarchist society, I would just hope that, all of the peer reviewing just begins at a very decentral sort of level. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the society that we create is going to be perfect, right? I think that's always the wrong way to go. But what I will say is that it seems to me that if all you did was begin by removing paywalling, by letting peer review be done essentially by anyone that could give their feedback and give their criticism, that it was in fact not in a situation where you have some a narrow panel of people that just so happen to own the stake in a journal company, which is also very weird that private entities have anything to do with mediating scientific knowledge.
And profit immensely through that as well.
A huge amount, yeah. Right? And in fact, the peer reviewers themselves are often not even paid, which is what a lot of people don't even know, which makes it even more bizarre, right? I guess I shouldn't say that. In capitalism, it's usually the people doing the least amount of work that make the most. But that's the situation you're in here, right? The people doing the most amount of work, which is to say the person producing the science, doing the research, and the people doing the peer review have essentially no control over any of these entities, have almost no feedback. They essentially are still at the whims and dictates of some private entity in a field that is supposed to be all about the bottom-up control, natural, organic production of human knowledge. So I would say if you just apply anarchistic principles to these things, you'd probably see a lot of improvements in these functions. But I also don't want to pretend that the pursuit of human knowledge is ever going to be able to permanently extricate itself from producing echo chambers or producing, misinformation or people doing bad science or self-aggrandizing or any of these things. It's just that you can create systems which minimize the ability of people to do those things and maximize the ability of people to do science without needing to get into the ivory tower. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I guess similar to how you were able to kind of just bootstrap the concept of Bitcoin and generate abstractions that are of a higher level, like for example Ethereum has this whole Turing-complete language, which you can program interactions between nodes, which are more complex than just a simple transaction. It seems like you're suggesting something of this type, where the scientific interaction between communities or between groups of people is mediated to a protocol that is agreed upon, and that's probably what's lacking right now. The protocol is basically centralized into these journals, and we don't have a way of actually communicating amongst ourselves in a way that's both consent-based and that you can put your work and not be afraid that you're going to be either scooped or mislabeled or misinterpreted, and that the information is there, that the data is there, because also besides the work itself is also no access to the data that made the paper, for example. It's also a big problem in science. Open access, open data, and open source code. So it seems like all of these initiatives are closely linked to what could be, as you're saying, a potential future for science.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are also some things I don't know if we're going to go into, but just the demand for the metric impact as a metric is really damaging to how science is done. The demand that in order for scientists to get grants, they have to demonstrate that their science is going to produce like an invention or is going to have some like coherent qualitative or quantitative impact on technology, or somehow is going to be involved in the economy. Like, that's just not how science is supposed to be done, right? Like, you're supposed to be seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake. If it's useful, great, but you're trying just to know more. It's supposed to be what science is all about. So we essentially just have a variety of perverse incentives that make scientists go down really sort of nonsensical rabbit holes sometimes.
Yeah.
I think this is a nice point to highlight how actually centralized nodes are necessary points at some times, because I mean, you want open access, you want open source, but at the same time, the people who give you access to that also have to be paid or be financed. You want non-productive or non-profit based, but that also depends on the institutions that fund science. So I think this is a good example where we can say it's okay to have centralized, but that communicate with each other and support each other to the point in which they can promote in a non-centralized or decentralized manner science or knowledge.
No, I get what you're getting at here. And one of the things that you run into here is that the answer to these questions highly depend on what stage of revolutionary progress that we would be at, right? Like, if we're talking about in the world as it stands today, it seems obvious to me that federal grants are one of the best ways for us to give out money. If only federal grants were to just have the aspect of demanding that they could demonstrate some feasible benefit in the next 10 years taken out, and they were just give money to these departments to do research however they pleased, we would see enormous improvements in the way science was conducted. If we're talking about, say, some transition where a market still exists and there's still currency, but it's highly anarchistic, I think you would hope to see some mass confederation of all of these communes or all of these councils as they stand, like taking some amount of all of their money, dumping it in together into some enormous fund, which is then reappropriated to scientists as they need in order to do research. That's what I would say would be a great way to do it. And then if you're talking about perhaps a fully anarcho-communist society, well, you've disentangled money completely. Now you're just essentially, oh, what resources do you need to do the research? Cool, here's the resources, right? You would have zero mediation between the scientist and his needs. You would essentially just be in a situation where the scientist would be able to create whatever he needs, because that would be, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And his need is to create a particle collider. So you give him the resources to create a particle collider. So it really depends on what stage of society we're at.
How do you see currently possible trajectories for the transition towards something like a full anarcho-communist society? Do you feel like there's some crossroads we can encounter that might lead us to even worse of outcome? Or how do you see this trajectory.
You're saying, how do I see the transition between where we currently are to a fully anarcho-communist society?
Yeah, I'm asking because, for example, societies that have taken this more anarchist model and anarchist structures and more communal type of living, it's always either a consequence of huge conflicts, like say, for example, Rojava in Syria, it's a great example. Zapatistas, and there's always some tension that is there and explodes, and then there's a space to be filled by something completely new. And either we assume that there's always going to have to be some sort of destructive element for the revolution to happen, or else you're always going to have seeds of the previous capitalist societies always coming in and always stopping this progress of occurring. Or there might be ways in which you have a slower but still steady transition into something like that. How do you see this transition?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's absolutely true that you find that revolutions take place in times of rupture, right? But I don't even know if that's necessarily uniquely true for anarchism. I just think that there's a sort of myth of continuity that takes place within very powerful state structures and really just societies as they stand for long periods of time, to where people get convinced that because something has continuity, because it is continuous, that it is therefore sort of legitimate, right? So in times of rupture, the veil gets ripped away. We're actually currently experiencing that. Right, we're in this situation where they failed us so miserably with coronavirus, and almost everywhere, even the places that responded well didn't respond like exceptionally well. Right, so you're in this situation where you almost need the veil of continuity to be ripped away for people to truly revolt and demand and reform something different. But I do think you can plant the seeds of what is necessary such that in that time of rupture, in that new space, in that like fertile soil, that you have already begun tending the seeds of something that is going to replace it. So an example I've used before to describe that is sort of the Spanish anarchists before the Spanish Civil War. A lot of people look at that and they're like, how did that happen? Why did anarchism just blow up? You know, like why was anarchism so successful in that exact circumstance, but then in these other circumstances it just did not seem to work nearly as well?
Yeah, they're able to stay for 2 years, I think, in a fully anarchist society. It was incredible.
With several million people.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like it was a lot of people functioning in this anarchist society. And the answer, as far as I can see, is that they had been radicalizing people for decades before that. They had been teaching people about anarchism. They had been spreading the work of like people like Erika Malatesta and Kropotkin and Bakunin, and essentially teaching people about these ideas such that when the time of rupture came, they were prepared. They were just like, you go out to, instead of you going out to the countrysides and saying, hey, we're going to need you to force a completely new way of life. I know you guys have no idea what we're even demanding of you, but I'm going to need you to radically change everything about how your life functions. That is not what happened. They essentially just went out into the countrysides and said, hey, remember all that stuff we've been talking about for the last 20 years? Let's do it. And the rural and the peasants were just on board because they'd already done the job of planting the seeds. So essentially the way I see it is that you should be trying to plant the seeds of the new world in the one that currently exists. The IWW has a saying along this line, to build the new in the shell of the old, right? Do as much as you can to build the structures that are going to persist through into the new world. And if you build them and they're strong enough, they may even, in fact, themselves create the time of rupture. They may themselves destabilize the previous regime by them becoming powerful as an entity and therefore threatening the previous paradigm of society. Or it might be that they just exist until the time of rupture comes and they seize the moment and say, hey, look, we've already got this decentralized network of fully functional, whatever, cooperatives, councils. How about we just spread this idea? Why don't we just give these more power? Why don't we just get more buy-in? And so I think the answer is very conditional, right? It's going to matter on your circumstances, but in all occasions, you should be attempting to plant the seeds beforehand.
But if you think of the German socialists, for example, it was pretty much the same thing, right? I mean, there was a lot of socialist influence in Germany before the Great War and after. And you had a big structure of socialism in Germany that was ready to take power. And you had unions, you had syndicates, you had informed people, you had reading circles, everything, but nothing happened.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the exact opposite. And then you have the other pole, which was Russia, where the people were not ready. Socialism was not widespread as in Germany, but the revolution happened.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's also important, would you say, to acknowledge that there is this big element of contingency within any change. It's not something that you necessarily prepare, but it's something that also just happened somehow. And I think your example with the Spanish anarchists is quite powerful.
Yeah. I mean, it is highly contingent. I've discussed this with friends of mine, right? We've sort of tried to look at experiments like Rojava and the Zapatistas and the Spanish anarchists and, the Shinmin prefecture and so on and so on and so on, and say, what are the unifying features here? And pretty much the only unifying feature we ever found was that they did a lot of prefiguration. They tried to educate people in a holistic fashion, but other than that, it was hard to find essentially the conclusion that several of us had to come to was that it's almost like you're just playing a game of chance, and you just hope to create enough prefiguration. You hope to educate people enough so that when your time of rupture comes, or you yourself create a rupture, that you can seize the moment, and then you just hope that you're one of the ones that goes through. But there is a significant element of chance that is all mixed up in this. I think that if you were to tell somebody who had an extraordinary knowledge of geopolitics, and you were to explain the conditions of northeastern Syria and the Syrian civil war and Rojava and the PKK having the Turkey on their back for a long time, and you were to be like, do you think they're going to be able to create an autonomous region which supports itself for nearly a decade and with all of these conditions? I think they would have been highly skeptical. Right? They would have been highly skeptical. They would have said, certainly not. You're probably not going to definitely not going to have 4.5 million people functioning under this thing. And it's almost certain that Syria and Turkey are just going to crush it out of existence within the first few years. But yet that's not what's taking place, right? Like Rojava continues to exist, continues to maintain its autonomy, still has this enormous population of people, even with one of the world's superpowers, one of the military superpowers on its back. So what I would say is just, it's very reliant upon when these projects do arise and we go, oh my God, wow, okay, there it is. One of them's finally successful. One of them's finally rising up and solidifying in a manner that actually looks like it might be able to sustain itself. We have to put an enormous amount of effort into helping it and trying to give it as much solidarity and support as conceivably possible, because there are going to be, dozens of projects which don't do that for every one that exists.
I guess the common factor is also the level, all the societies that were mentioned were mostly rural, and so the amount of information circulating, or let's say if you do plant a seed, it had more chance of growing in that particular community than in a much more dense city type society, where you not only are within this technological echo chamber within the city, which has a lot of wind, let's say, and affects a lot of the opinions and the ideologies that are circulating around that area. So besides the seed, it seems like you need some hubs that are at least small trees that can also play that role. And they're less susceptible to the ebbs and flows of how these societies tend to change. Almost like mimicking, yeah.
No, that seems true. But actually, I'll say I don't think that that's unique to anarchism. I think that you'll find that most of these revolutions that were successful in which is to say they created a successful revolt and overthrew the previous paradigm, almost all of them were in rural societies. But one of the interesting things about Spain is that actually at that time, Spain was one of the most industrialized nations on the planet. So, and the anarchists were actually highly successful at organizing the industrial areas of Spain before the Spanish Civil War. So it's interesting because yes, it seems as if the rural aspect is 100% an important thing that is needed. In fact, how you interact with rural areas seems like it's one of the big contingencies of the success of any of these revolutionary projects. But it also seems that there is a successful campaign that can play out in these urban centers, even in highly industrialized nations. But it has to be fearlessly militant, right? The Spanish anarchists were just fearless, right? They were in a time where there was already an extraordinary government opposition to them, and they were building militant unions. They were literally just seizing workplaces, even though they were being told that the military was going to be sicked on them. They were just literally walking into workplaces, telling the owners, you don't own this workplace anymore, the workers do. And then when they come to take it, they just literally fight until the military went away. And they just did that over and over and over, to the point to where they would start to go into factories, and business owners, they'd just say, yo, you saw what happened down the corner, right? Like, you see what we've already done. I mean, you're going to have this whole process play out again. And the owner would just be like, I guess not. You guys can just have it. Right? Like, that started to happen, as crazy as that sounds. So it's not impossible. I just think it takes like a sort of fearless approach that perhaps a lot of people are probably not comfortable with in the modern day.
And probably also the absence of Netflix as well, because you do need a lot of focus to go through a whole revolutionary process. And these things absorb a lot of the time and the mind frame people have to deal with these questions.
Bread and circuses works. There's a reason why they did it in Rome.
Okay.
So yeah. I guess what we're actually kind of stumbling upon here is why some people are third worldists, right? This is why some people call themselves third worldists, because they think that the only place where you're going to have this sort of like susceptible citizenry that is ready and available to be revolutionized are in these places that are not heavily industrialized, where there are not all these distractions, where people are not in close proximity to sort of the benefits of empire, the benefits of being, coddled by the, excesses of the bourgeois, etc. Right? I would say I'm terrified of that conclusion, because we are in an inevitable cycle of industrializing the planet. And then the question becomes, well, okay, if only rural areas can ever do it, aren't we just screwed? Right? Like, there's no way we ever get a revolution then, because I got bad news. All the rural areas are becoming metropolises little by little. So what are you going to do when the whole planet is industrialized,
So it connects nicely with the whole discussion of the decentralized web, because you can make a rural internet to some extent, which is a bit insulated in terms of what community is holding on, and has some access to outside communities, and it can communicate, like, for example, the dark web. In some sense, what happens there, few people know the entirety of it, but there's a community that lives in that space and is able to do lots of things. And it maintains whatever structure it has for a long time without being disturbed. So maybe we need kind of something like that, like a rural internet, and an approach in which you have a village of information instead of having the whole planet, and you can still access the essential things that you need to do science, to do work, and so on. But you are a bit off the main global narrative that is happening at the moment, to some extent. Maybe that's one way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super informed about the idea of like a rural internet, but yeah, it seems like it would be necessary for sure, or rather it would be very beneficial.
And at the same time, we already talked about contingency, right? I mean, everything seems monolithical now. Everything seems like it's on a path to endless progress. But then, I don't know, the COVID pandemic comes and people see the cracks in the monolith. And then you have police violence, and then people start rioting and start demanding for change in one of the most monolithical culture in a political sense, in a really static culture, and one that actually informs the entire planet. So it's it's maybe wrong to think we need isolated areas where we start our projects. It's more of waiting, like you said, preparing and waiting for the right moment presents itself wherever it.
Certainly. I mean, the sort of third worldist critique would never have conceived that there would be a rebellion in the imperial core, right? It would just say that there can't be a rebellion in the imperial core, number one, and number two, you should never expect it to happen because they're so coddled by being, from the benefits of empire. There's just no way you're going to see them revolt. I think what a lot of people who don't live in the United States don't understand is that the United States is not actually that great of a place to live right now. It is actually a horrifying police state. I mean, you constantly have police around you. You're constantly hearing stories of police brutality. We've had a 30-year stultifying minimum wage. Our people are actually, most people are like in poverty by the standards of our own nation. We don't have healthcare. The vast majority of people don't have healthcare, and when they do have access to it, it is astonishingly expensive. Our pension, our parents' generation pensions were all destroyed in 2008. So most people don't even have retirement savings. So we're in situations now where we have our parents not even being able to retire. We're the new generations, the millennials and the Zoomers are in a process where we're coming to an economy that just like has no jobs, and the jobs that are available pay us basically nothing. And then we're being told, stop complaining. It's just going. When you live in the imperial core, you're in a dystopia. You know what I'm saying? You're in a dystopia. It very much is like 1984 inside of the United States, but a lot of people don't understand it because of that myth of continuity. They don't recognize how badly they're being treated, how much better they could be being treated because they are in the imperial core. We should be demanding so much more from this nation, yet it has convinced us we can demand nothing. So that just gets so tiring at some point. And when you have essentially a nation of people, you have all of the people who are coddled by the system aging out, actually become retiring little by little and leaving the seats of power. They've reduced our job market to an extraordinary degree to where now, okay, they hand over those jobs. That's just not that many jobs. Right? Like even the jobs that the boomers are handing over to the millennials and Generation Z is just not enough to actually sort of do the coddling that is necessary to turn us into subservient cogs in the machine. And then all on top of all of that, we have a government that is also not responding to the needs of a global pandemic, as we are now having hundreds of thousands of cases. We have to be afraid that our parents who can't retire or are retiring in close to poverty might die if we go see them. And then we keep getting news that our police are kneeling on the necks of innocent people and suffocating them to death. It was bound to reach this rupture. It just needed the condition. You know what I'm saying?
But maybe just one final question for myself, because you've mentioned the myth of continuity, and I think this is a really important moment to talk about it, because if you look at the history of the US, during any crisis, any election that has happened was basically under this myth of continuity. The president that was in the White House got reelected no matter what, during a war, during financial crisis, because it's assumed continuity is better during a crisis than change. And the US has upcoming elections. The US has currently 2 crises. Do you think the myth of continuity will prevail? Or do you think people can actually start and see the cracks within this myth?
I think it's very difficult to predict how this is going to turn out. I would say if I'm reading the room correctly, Joe Biden's going to lose. And it's not because it's really, I would say, not related to the myth of continuity. It's more just because people are just so fed up with the politicians who represent the establishment that they are fully willing to just burn the whole thing down again, right? Trump was very much I think this is probably hard for a lot of people outside of the United States to understand, but I think for a lot of people, they were voting for him because he was a brick through the window, right? They knew what they were doing. They knew that they were causing destruction in the system. They knew that this was going to cause problems. They did it for the very reason it would cause problems. But that is going to attract a lot of people who are already highly racist, who didn't really care how it was going to affect anyone but themselves, right? And a lot of people who were that were taken in by right-wing anti-establishment narratives. And of course, there's a variety of other things we could go into. But I think that Joe Biden represents that establishment. And I think it's not clear that people are going to seek to return to that establishment in this time of crisis. Right now, it looks like they're within only about 2 points of each other. So it is definitely not clear which of them is going to win. And I'm actually at a point where I'm not convinced it makes a huge difference who is going to win. I don't think at this point, the material conditions of our society are going to be meaningfully improved no matter which of them is in office. Joe Biden is not going to improve any of the problems that we see. Most of what is said to have gotten worse under Trump were the very things that got worse under Barack Obama. So it is very difficult to then look and say, well, see what happens in November. I almost don't even care what happens in November. It seems to me that we're in the time now where we better be building the prefigured bodies that are ready to take over society as this rupture grows.
Okay, thank you.
And one from me as well. In Europe right now, we're seeing the emergence of a lot of ecological communities, which are based on permaculture, sustainable living. They also have a lot of other anarchist principles regarding with free love and so on. One of them is in Portugal, actually has roughly 200, 300 people. And it's seeing kind of, it's serving as also a bootstrapping of other communities that are now seeing that thing being able to be done, and they are also starting their own communities. Also a friend of mine that also trying to start a community herself. And I was wondering if this is also happening in the States, if because these are potential seeds for an anarchist society. And I was wondering if they're in the States, in your state, for example, if you see these communities rising, or how do you see potential seeds for upcoming anarchist revolution?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that anybody knows who has looked at the map of the United States is that it is massive, right? Essentially, the states are almost like the size of some nations. So the differences between what different states are doing are enormous. Like in Oklahoma, I don't think that the project of prefiguration is being carried out in a significant sense. But when you look at projects like Cooperation Jackson, which is in Jackson, Mississippi, with anarchists ahead of it, like Kali Akuno, there are these projects being carried out. There are definitely broader coalitions that are attempting to develop things like neighborhood councils that are indeed trying to create cooperative networks that are not just there to gain profits for the people that are working in them, but are in fact political entities that they are attempting to group together into council structures in order to make a more democratic society. Perhaps you might say carrying out sort of Bookchin vision of the way that you transform these conditions. So these things are happening. I would say not to be critical, because I think that people are doing what they can, but it is not taking place at the rate I would say it probably needs to be taking place in order for us to have a real fighting chance to fill the vacuum when the time comes. But it is indeed, yes, being done. I think one of the organizations which is best at it, or rather is trying its hardest to do it right now, is a group called Symbiosis, who's really not big enough to be a significant player. But I think if they could grow to the size of, say, the DSA, they could be making massive changes. And if more people were to look at the project of Cooperation Jackson and attempt to emulate it in their conditions, I think we would see some very transformative changes take place. One last note. During the coronavirus in America, as probably most people know, our government essentially did nothing. So we were in a situation where people had to develop mutual aid networks. So early on during the pandemic, when it began, you had lots of leftist groups coordinating mutual aid networks, beginning to build these sort of naturally coming to the conclusion that these anarchist structures were needed just by looking at their circumstances. I think those probably established a lot of very good relations between these leftist organizations and the communities that they're in, and probably also taught a lot of people that what anarchists were telling them to do was not pie in the sky. It was in fact a highly practical response to the needs of the people and the situations. So I think all of these things together mean that there's promise, but it needs to expand to an unprecedented degree for it to really do something significant.
Thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your knowledge. And I hope things in the States turn out better than they are right now. And I hope people find ways for positive change amongst this chaos.
I appreciate it.
This concludes our first episode of what we hope to be a long-lasting series. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us, and thank you all for listening.